Not Quite Right features discussions that are unfiltered and uncensored and may include themes that are inappropriate for younger listeners. Also, I swear a lot.
Something doesn't seem quite right.
Welcome to Not Quite Right. My name's Ed.
And I'm Amanda.
This is the second of our Daredevils for the April 2025 Not Quite Right prize. And as a reminder, Daredevils are people who have volunteered for the honour and the privilege of being eviscerated by us on the podcast.
And I think this Daredevil is one that kind of likes getting roasted. And I guess the evidence for that is that she's back for a second time.
She's back for more. So some listeners might remember her from her story A Non-Consensual Truth back in the October round last year, which was about some psychic women who were being held captive by a man.
Yes, that's right. So this is Sarah Kennedy. So thank you, Sarah, for coming along for another ride. And I don't think we held back last time.
No, I don't think we did.
So let's see how we go this time.
Let's see how far we can take it.
So Sarah, very kindly from all the way over the other side of the world, actually managed to get someone signed up for my workshop,
Amazing.
which will have already occurred.
Yeah.
So I will have met this person. And I think she was hoping that we'd go a little easier on her for doing us that little favour. And I don't know if it works like that, Sarah. I'm sorry.
It's not
Sorry
how
to
it
break
works
it to you. But very much appreciated.
Okay, so before we get into it, just a reminder that the April 2025 Not Quite Right prize prompts were the word seal, the action of wiping out, and the anti-prompt of breaking the rule, kill your darlings. So now here is At Least It's Not Real Diarrhea by Sarah Kennedy. Dylan paced the stockroom. He clutched the puzzle box as he rehearsed the lines prepared by his brother. Back sweat soaked through his uniform, but there was no time to change. Charlotte walked through the door.
Morning.
She said. Morning, Charlotte. You look beautiful today, he replied, staring at her intently and emphasizing each word just as his brother instructed. Charlotte stopped.
You taking the piss?
She said. No, you just look nice.
I look like shit. I'm hungover to fuck and my skin's broken out.
You look radiant, Charlotte.
Why do you keep saying my name?
Dylan cursed his brother's advice that repeating a girl's name would make her feel special. Changing tack, he presented the puzzle box.
What's this?
She asked, inspecting the box. A box. It's for you. She traced the intricate patterns etched into the wood.
It's beautiful.
Open it. Charlotte pulled at the box, twisting it, turning it over, but nothing.
It won't open.
She said. Exactly. She frowned.
You've given me a sealed box?
Dylan hadn't rehearsed any questions about the present. Without direct instruction, he was at a loss. It's an interesting word, seal, he said. Multiple definitions and particularly popular in cliches and common phrases such as seal the deal, seal the area, his fate was sealed, my lips are sealed, sealed with a kiss. Charlotte didn't respond. This wasn't working. His brother had warned against his usual pointless facts and boring conversation. With every word, Dylan was wiping out any chance with Charlotte.
You're weird.
She eventually said. So people say.
What am I meant to do with it?
Charlotte asked, holding up the box. It's a puzzle box. You need to solve it. You're a private person. With this, you can keep things hidden, away from other people.
That's sweet.
She said, looking away.
Thanks.
And it will exercise your brain muscles. Although the brain isn't a muscle, it's nerve tissue. Sorry, I'm doing it again.
Doing what?
Talking too much. This was supposed to go more smoothly.
What was?
Asking you out. Charlotte laughed.
You're asking me out?
Yes. I've practiced what to say, so it wouldn't sound, well, so much like me. Verbal diarrhea, my brother calls it. Still, at least it's not real diarrhea.
Your brother can fuck himself.
She cut in. I'm sorry?
Yeah, you talk a lot, but that's just you. You're weird and you're interesting.
She took his hand.
If he doesn't like it, that's his problem. I just don't get why you're asking me out.
Because you're a bit wonky. Like me.
What?
She dropped his hand. I just mean I like your company. You're yourself. No pretenses. And you're kind. To me, at least.
Okay, then.
She said, smiling. Okay.
Let's go for a drink, and who knows, if it goes well, we might seal the deal with a kiss.
Her face fell into her hands.
Did I really just say that?
Dylan grinned. Verbal diarrhea must be contagious.
Well, that was super fun. I felt like we were rehearsing lines from like a high school play or
It did
something.
feel
Did
a
you
bit
feel
like
like
that,
that?
yeah.
I felt really awkward reading
It was
that.
totally. You
So
know
good
what?
fun. Thank you, Sarah.
In our interview with Dean on the long list episode, he did say that our entrants do have a preoccupation with bodily functions. I think this story highlights that. So thanks, Sarah, for your story. And Sarah has left us some notes in the brief explanation field, so I'll read that now. She said, I approached the anti-prompt in two ways. First was a verbal take on Kill Your Darlings. For Dylan, the main character, he's advised to kill his verbal darlings, but he doesn't, and it works for him. Second was the cheesy ending. I'd likely have deleted or amended it, but I loved the cheese, so I kept it in. The whole idea came to me by researching uses of the word seal and then thinking of a character who would talk about those uses, which then led to verbal diarrhea. And then we had Dylan. I loved writing this, but I'm not really a romance writer, so not sure how this will land.
But Sarah sent us a message, so do you want to play that now?
Yeah, let's play that now.
Hello, it's Sarah. Just leaving a message for my Daredevil episode. So I'm not very good at beautiful prose, and I think that's why I've been writing a lot of dialogue-heavy stories recently, and not just for Not Quite Right, but also for other competitions. Feedback on that has been varied. Some people have been really positive about it, other people not so much. So I think that's where I'd like some advice. I've had feedback on using too many or not enough dialogue tags and action beats, on the pacing of my stories, feeling rushed, on not having the right balance between dialogue and scene setting, not being varied enough and breaking it up. Also, people struggling to follow who's talking. But again, other people have really liked that and found that it does work. So I'm finding it hard to understand what does and doesn't work with that. So I guess I'd like feedback and advice on how to get that balance, how to improve my pacing and my scene setting, and what is the right sort of level of dialogue tags and action beats to incorporate within dialogue. But also any feedback, as always, is most appreciated. Thank you.
So thanks, Sarah, and a lot of great questions there. Hopefully we can hit all of those points as we walk through the story. I will say, though, like stories that have a lot of dialogue, I think they work really well in a flash fiction setting just because they're very easy to read.
That's interesting that you say that, because I actually hold the opposite opinion.
Really?
I'm not a big fan of dialogue-heavy stories, just as a personal preference kind of thing. That's not to say one couldn't win or something like that, because certainly when it's done well, then I appreciate it. But it's not something, I guess, that I'm naturally like inclined towards.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying that readability-wise, and they tend to be very easy to follow, and they tend to be very easy to drop into and very easy to read. So it all then comes down to like the quality of the dialogue and can you still tell the story effectively through the dialogue. I agree that balance is needed, and having some more description, some more other elements apart from dialogue, usually will enhance that story. But I think a dialogue heavy story can do better than like a story with no dialogue, if you know what I mean. Like one side of those probably reads a bit easier. You did express some concerns about following the characters and dialogue tags. I didn't have any problem at all following who was speaking during this story, so I don't think that's a concern here.
It may have been in an earlier draft and maybe some people picked that up, which is great if that's the case, because that's exactly what you want beta readers for. Like to say, this bit confused me, I wasn't sure who was speaking. That's so easily solved.
Yeah.
So that's really wonderful if that's what happened in your writing process there.
But yeah, there are things that you can do to make the story more compelling, like by stepping away from the dialogue. So hopefully we'll get into that during our discussion.
Yeah, and look, I'll just add to that, I suppose, that my preference is for more of a balance, right?
Yeah.
Like I like stories that do have scene setting and do have action and do have like character development in other ways as well. You can, of course, develop character through dialogue. And dialogue is kind of equivalent to action in some ways, like in terms of balance. I think those two things are kind of equivalent in a way. So you're trying to balance dialogue and action against things like interiority, for example, and exposition and, backstory and stuff like that. So, but yeah, I mean, that's personal preference. I think speaking to Dean about this stuff, I think he probably is like you. I think he likes dialogue stories and can see how they can be quite compelling. The strength of them, of course, is that you get that voice really clearly, like character voice can come through, which can be really fun and really compelling. And they also often have conflict, right? If you've got two people having a conversation, there's often going to be some conflict between them, and that's what they're kind of working through. So I definitely think those things are strengths of a dialogue story.
Yeah, and like I find in my own writing, I'm actually really dialogue light. So maybe it's just that when I read a dialogue heavy story, like I appreciate that's something that I don't normally do. So it's a different skill set to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically it comes down to what serves that story.
Yeah.
Like what's the best for that story. And I think some stories work as dialogue only and some need more balance. So let's look into this story. And maybe as we go, we can sort of focus on that dialogue issue, if that's something that Sarah's particularly interested in learning about. But yeah, I'm sure we'll have some other thoughts as well.
So let's get into it. So we've got it's not a meet cute. It's like the next step of a relationship. The opening line, Dylan paced the stock room. He clutched the puzzle box as he rehearsed the lines prepared by his brother. Back sweat soaked through his uniform, but there was no time to change. Charlotte walked through the door. So what I love about this opening line is that it sets the scene well. We kind of know that we're in the real world, we're in the current day. We don't really know what kind of place they work in. It's a storeroom, could be like retail. I don't know, could be a restaurant as well. So I guess that those details are not relevant, but they could also enhance kind of your mental picture of the scene.
Yeah, that's one little comment I had that I would have loved. Just what stockroom?
Yeah.
Like it literally just one more word. Because it does help paint a picture a little bit. Although even on top of that, you could have used a detail from that scene and brought that into the scene a little bit just to give us a little bit more sensory detail to just really drop in. Because it's perfectly fine. We've got all the information we need. But from an emotional point of view, I guess, like let's really immerse ourselves in that scene before we get to the next bit. And I don't think it would take much. But that's a minor criticism because I don't think it's a missing detail necessarily. Like we can proceed from there.
The other thing it does is like set up a little bit of this tension. So he's pacing the stock room. So we know that there's some expectation there. He hasn't had time to change. He's obviously in a rush. Something's about to happen. So we do kind of have that expectation. Apart from that, it doesn't do a whole lot of like, there's no backstory. We don't know who Dylan is. We don't know who Charlotte is, but we're just giving us the scene so we can step into the dialogue with enough information to follow what's happening.
Yeah, we've got the central conflict, I guess, or the central dramatic question, which is what we mentioned in the last Daredevil episode, that you kind of want to be setting up that dramatic question right at the start. And we've also named Dylan in that very first line. And we talked about naming your characters in the last Daredevil episode as well. But yeah, I think basically this opening does a good job of setting up the who, the when, and the where.
Yep.
And I think that's all it needed to do. And we can quibble and say, we would have liked a little bit more here or there. But it's doing what it needs to do. It's ticking those boxes.
Okay. So the first line of dialogue comes in. Morning, she said. And this is a minor point, but I would probably ditch that line. Like it's not necessary. He comes back with, morning, Charlotte, you look beautiful today. And he could just say that.
He could just say that. I mean, we already know that Charlotte's walked through the door, so it's like you can choose how you present that. You can just say Charlotte says morning, or you tell us that she walked through the door. One or the other is fine.
But it is setting up that dynamic that she's very brief and abrupt with her words, and maybe she has the shits, and he's very much like trying to be charming in this
Yeah, I mean, it totally works. I think this is a little nitpick, and I don't know if this is stupid. We'll see what you think, Ed. But he's like soaked with back sweat.
Yeah.
And his shift is like, it seems like it's just beginning. I mean, he could have worked the night shift for all I know. But even so, it seems odd to me that like he's nervous. I get that he's nervous and that's the issue. But this idea of he didn't even have time to change, like, would you be changing at the start of a shift? Like, would that be an expectation? So it's such a little nothing. But, you know, worth thinking about.
I don't know. I wasn't sure, like, what the context was there. I don't feel like there was enough information to make me think of, like, was it the start of the shift? Was it the end of the shift? And he had, I don't know, he had to catch her in the stockroom before, like, she went out to do her job. What's his job? What's her job? Is his back sweat just nervousness?
Well, that's what's implied, I guess, that it's nervousness. But I think the only thing that triggered me, because all of those things could make sense. It's not like it doesn't make sense. But I think just the previous line, but there was no time to change.
Yeah.
Like this expectation that he would change. Like you don't normally change your clothes at work. You might change at the very end of a shift or before a shift, but you don't sort of change in the middle of a shift usually, depending on your job. So I guess it's totally stupid. I'm totally overthinking it. But these little details sometimes, you know, it's something that I come back and look at in more detail. It's probably not something that really...
I guess I pictured this happening, this is just me, in a Pizza Hut, because I used to work at Pizza Hut and, you know...
this happened to you?
This exact thing happened. So in my mind, I pictured it happening in a Pizza Hut, even though there's no indication that it's any kind of restaurant.
No, it's a Pizza Hut now. Sorry, Sarah. It's now officially a Pizza Hut that this is happening. I wonder where Sarah pictured... I pictured definitely retail.
Yeah.
But I worked in retail, so maybe that's it. I worked in a clothing store, so...
Yeah. So, morning, Charlotte. You look beautiful today, he replied, staring at her intently and emphasising each word just as his brother instructed. And, you know, I like that this starts providing that context right away of who these characters are, what their goals are within the scene, the fact that he's obviously trying to pick her up in whatever way, you know, and that he has his brother off to the side in his mind who's like the mentor trying to guide him through this process. The wingman may be misguided or whatever it is, trying to tell him what to say.
I think too, subtextually, we now know these are young people.
Yep.
Right? Because I think that emphasis on your brother giving you advice, like that implies that you're, you know, like a teenager probably. So that's nice. You know, I always like when those details are revealed through the story. You don't have to tell me how old he is or how old Charlotte is. We've sort of got a picture of them. And we don't actually have any physical details whatsoever about these characters. And, you know, that's something you could add, but I'm always whinging about describing hair colour and eye colour. I don't think it really matters. We've got enough information to appreciate what's going on here.
Yeah, some people really like having that detail. I don't think that's not me and that's not you. Like, I don't really care what colour hair and eyes people have. I don't think it's beside the point.
But I do think it would be nice to have a little bit more about the characters. Like we're getting a picture of Dylan here. We get to the verbal diarrhea, right? And he may have some sort of neurodivergence that he's working with, or he may just be like me and just suffer from verbal diarrhea. But like, so we've got that detail about him, but it would be nice to maybe get just a little bit more into like why he likes her. You know what I mean? I think that's something in romances that you really want. Like Charlotte at this point is just a person who happens to be there.
Yeah.
She's female. Yeah. Like what else is it about Charlotte? Like we know she swears and she's a bit rough. But like, what else? Like, why is he into her? Why has he been seeking his brother's advice to ask her out?
Yeah, it's because he's awkward and she's awkward. I guess we don't really get that awkwardness coming through so much in this interaction. He's trying to be someone else, but, you know, he still has the verbal diarrhea. She's just kind of shitty in this story. She's a bit like...
Like, what's your problem? Why are you talking to me like that?
What are you doing? Like, what's going on? We don't kind of get the aspect of her being weird. We just get her just being like, what are you doing? Yeah,
he describes her as wonky, and we'll get to that later. But, like, I hadn't experienced her. I mean, she very much is me. I mean, like, the way she talks and the way she acts, like, I very much resonated with her. I had no trouble with that dialogue in that reading just now. But... what's wonky about her? Like, she's a bit rough around the edges maybe, but like...
Now you're just getting defensive.
Super defensive.
What are you saying?
But you know what I mean? Like, he's finding it really awkward. I'm not sure that she was being awkward in that same way. She was just kind of reacting to him. Yeah. And it didn't come to me as awkward. She was just responding to him.
Yeah, she's taken a bit by surprise. It's clear that that's not the way that their relationship has been. And he's turned up and been this person, and she's like, what are you doing?
Yeah. So, yeah, I think there's an opportunity there perhaps with that dialogue to sort of establish who she is, why she's appealing to him, like what he likes about her, and to show that right up front.
Okay, so her response is... you're taking the piss. I look like shit. I'm hungover as fuck and my skin's broken out. And these are very Amanda responses. And meanwhile,
isn't that pretty much what I said when I arrived here
I
today?
think it might have been.
You're like, hi, and I'm like, listen.
First of all, fuck you.
It's funny because it's true. Anyway, enough about me. Let's talk about Charlotte.
And Dylan, he's doing his best. He's trying to be nice. He's trying to win her over.
Going a little overboard, you might say.
Yeah, so I do actually like this initial exchange of, you're taking the piss, you look nice. It sets up the fact that there is like these differences between them. They have different kind of goals in this situation. He's very clearly trying to get her on board. She's like, what's going on? And you've established that dynamic without using any description, just through the dialogue. So I think that's really good.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I do think it's a fun voice. Like, we all know I love a bit of swearing and whatever, but it is fun when you sort of come a bit more dramatic with it. When we've got that morning, good morning kind of thing, okay, we can take or leave that. But once it starts getting like, are you taking the piss? Like, that's the conflict. We're starting to see these people emerge and we're starting to see their relationship sort of develop. And I think that's really well done. Like, I think that's really important that the dialogue carries some weight like that.
So he gives her the puzzle box as the present, and there's this exchange. What's this? It's a box. It's beautiful. Open it. And we kind of go back and forth for a little while. She doesn't know what the box is for, and he goes off on this tangent around the word seal, right?
Poor Dylan.
And I think that's a great way of expressing his nervousness, his underlying issue with verbal diarrhea, which is, linking in to the title. I will say that given that the word prompt was seal, this really stood out.
It did, yeah.
Because we saw these exact phrases so many times in the story. So this was maybe a little bit too obvious.
A little bit too obvious, but I will say it's fun too. Like, I do appreciate when I see someone's gone hard and it's like, you really went with that, and it's like a confidence thing, I think, and I like that. But you're right, like, it does stand out, and in that sense it takes us out of the story, and you don't want that. You don't want us to go out of the story, even if it is to go out of the story and kind of laugh and just be like, that was cool, which is what I did. But yeah, it's not immersive. So that's a question for you. You're having fun, like, go for it.
Yeah.
Like, that's fine.
So she doesn't respond. He's worried it's not working. The brother has warned against his usual pointless facts and boring conversation. She calls him weird. He says, so people say, and then it returns back to, what am I meant to do with it? She says, holding up the box. And whereas I felt like in the opening of this story, the dialogue was really snappy and kind of natural and expressed these different desires, I felt like the conversation stalled a little bit at this point from like a reading perspective, because she's asked, what do I do with the box? And then he kind of diverts, and then we return to the box and we haven't kind of moved anywhere. I know that's part of what's being set up, but I also feel like we could just keep moving at that point.
Yeah, I think you've got to be careful, like with anything in flash fiction, like choosing your details and choosing what people say is super important. Now, if we're establishing that he has verbal diarrhea, this dialogue doesn't show that.
Yeah.
He's being very succinct.
Yeah.
She's like, you're weird. He's like, so people say. Like, he didn't keep going on about the word seal, for example, which is an opportunity. He could have done that. And of course, if you did do that, you'd run out of words pretty quickly. Yeah. So I'm not suggesting that you would necessarily do that, but it's not supporting the theme, and therefore, like, maybe is not necessary. Like, there's this exchange back and forth about the puzzle box. How much of that is actually like really adding value? Some of it is kind of transactional, like you kind of need to step from one thing to the other, but I think you could maybe rework that and think about, well, what's the most impactful thing they could say to each other now? And I think just talking about how the puzzle box works is not very interesting, but perhaps having a line that is like a bit more subtext, like implying things about their relationship or how they get on with each other, or what he likes about her, these things that are maybe a little bit more interesting in terms of like that emotional connection to the story. It's an opportunity there to think about, I guess, higher value dialogue.
And also having her react to what he says in a way that also progresses that same, I guess, scene goal, right? Because later on we have her agreeing and hooking up and, the whole time she wanted this to happen. But we don't really get that through this dialogue. We don't really get the
banter.
Yeah, we don't get the impression that she's into it so much, or that she's wanting this to continue or that she sees him in that way. She's just kind of saying, oh, you're weird and what's this for? And being a bit confused. And if we did have that subtext and a bit more around that dialogue where he was expressing that verbal diarrhea in a way that implied more and she was reacting to that positively, even if it was also implied, then that might have helped develop to the next stage of the scene.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something here that's going to feel like a huge piece of critique, but is actually not that big. I preface this with, and that is, I don't know if we need this puzzle box. And it is a key feature here, and it's like something that's addressed throughout this exchange of dialogue. And the reason I question it is because it's never really paid off.
Yeah.
So he does say at one point, well, you're a private person, you could keep secrets in it kind of thing. Yeah. First of all, that's not the vibe I get from this character, Charlotte. Is she a private person? She's like, I'm hungover as fuck. Like, is that private? Not really. Like, that doesn't gel for me as a very accurate character assessment of her when you've just sort of set her up as quite open and now you're saying she's quite private. I'm not sure that gels for me. But regardless, like this puzzle box, again, we go to Poe, my best friend. We're talking about verbal diarrhea. That's the theme that you wanted to explore here. I'm not sure that the puzzle box actually adds to that theme. Yeah. And I think there are perhaps other choices that you could make that further develop that verbal diarrhea thing. Whether it's a gift or not, you don't necessarily even need to have an exchange of a gift here. But you could, if you love the dialogue, Sarah, and if you see that as a strength of yours, then you could really play that up a little bit more. And like I said, you know, if you're going to play on the verbal diarrhea thing, it's going to take some words. Well, okay, get rid of the puzzle box. And now you've got some words to play with where you're just really leaning into that verbal diarrhea thing and that interplay between the two of them and how she's reacting and how, I guess, that will they, won't they question, which is at the heart of most romance stories, how you could escalate that to like build that stress, like, is this going to happen for him or not? You know? Whereas I'm not sure that the puzzle box really does that. That's kind of just a device that they talk about and then it's sort of from there, it doesn't sort of come back in at the end. Yeah.
Well, I'll say I like the puzzle box as it's a gift, right, that shows, you know, what Dylan thinks about her. It kind of expresses his perception of her. And I think for that it works well. But what you've pointed out is that it clashes with what we've seen about her. So it doesn't quite land. But yeah, like I agree it's not paid off. And you kind of expect that to go somewhere as more than just this is a token if it's being used as a plot device. In my mind, when I was thinking about this, and this is going into what I've written later, I think one of the things this scene needs is a little bit more drama, a little bit more conflict kind of to be amped up. Because in a moment, Charlotte basically says, okay, let's go out on a date kind of. And in my mind, I'm thinking like, what can you do to amplify this scene? And in my mind, it's like a Pizza Hut. What if the puzzle box gets dropped in like, I don't know, like boiling oil or something? You know what I mean? Like something as that puzzle box is paid off in a way that amplifies the drama.
Well, these are the options, right? So I'm saying at the moment it's not paid off and one option is to ditch it, okay?
Yeah.
Another option is to make it work and to pay it off. And so a thought I had was, okay, I don't necessarily agree that she's a private person based on what we've seen so far. Could we use that puzzle box in a different way where Dylan sees Charlotte as a puzzle that he can't solve?
Yeah.
And that's how he expresses that.
Yeah.
And that could be an interesting way to sort of build that tension, I guess, of how he sees her. Now, I love a puzzle box. I'm very much Charlotte here. I'm just like fully channeling Charlotte, right? But you know that how people say like, I feel seen?
Yeah.
If Dylan's gift of a puzzle box makes Charlotte feel seen, you've really seen me and who I am here. I think that could have that more romantic impact, right?
Yeah.
Like this guy, okay, he's got verbal diarrhea or whatever, he's a bit awkward, but like he gets me like no one else gets me. I think if we can make the puzzle box something very clearly, and look, it probably is in Sarah's mind, but more clearly expressed in the actual story that we receive as readers, that this puzzle box like makes her feel seen and that it makes her feel appreciated and understood by him in a way that feels deeply meaningful for her. And yeah, that could be that he sees her as a puzzle or that he sees like the hidden part of her kind of thing that maybe she doesn't express to other people. So maybe this like rough exterior is a bit of bravado and he sees actually the gentle side of her and that she's kind to him. And I think those clues are there, but I think it's about like sort of weaving them a little bit more tightly so that it feels a little bit more satisfying around that puzzle box gift.
Yeah. And so, look, I'm not going to go through line by line for the rest of the interaction because I think there's more to talk about that's on a bigger picture level. But we have this back and forth between the two and, you know, talking about the verbal diarrhea and the fact that they're both weird. And in the end, Charlotte says, "Are you asking me out?" And the answer is yes, basically, in an awkward way. So, like, there's some good banter there. There's some good, like, interaction between the two. What's missing for me there is, I guess, stakes and conflict. Apart from the nervousness, it's all very much in Dylan's head. But she seems to be, she's into it.
Just on that, like, there's the potential for conflict there. He calls her wonky.
Yeah.
Rude. And, you know, he's trying to ask her out and he calls her wonky, like, and her response is just like, okay then.
Yeah.
And then immediately she agrees to go out with him. Like, that's an opportunity. He's had his verbal diarrhea. He's said something he shouldn't have said about her out loud. That's an opportunity for her to react to that in a negative way that makes it all feel lost.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this guy's really put his foot. He was going all right. She was on board and then he's called her wonky and it's like, oh, sorry, mate, you've missed the boat. And to have that feeling of like, oh, it's all gone, and then to turn it back around again from a classic story structure point of view, that's what you're aiming for, like that feeling of all is lost, as Blake Snyder might say, and then turn that around to the climax where he wins her over. And yeah, I think she did just accept that, given that she's, you know, she's not accepted that he's sort of calling her Charlotte too many times, but she's okay with him calling her wonky. Didn't really ring true to me. I think we missed a beat there. And look, by this stage, we're sort of running out of words, so I understand why. But I think some words could be shaved off elsewhere to sort of have that emotional impact of his statement there.
I mean, there's a number of things you can do to inject some conflict into the scene. So one of the things that you mentioned was like she reacts to something that he said. Another thing I'll call out about this scene is that it is also very static. And like they're in one place, they're standing there, they're talking to each other. It's just two people. There's no movement right in the scene. It's just two people talking. Like something could happen. And I mentioned like the puzzle box falls into like some boiling oil or something that creates a bit of
into the pizza oven.
Whatever
Mamma mia.
it is. Mamma mia. Whatever it is. Or maybe she turns up not alone but with some guy, you know, and there's conflict. That way there's a bit of an unexpected turn of events, or like they're under time pressure. Maybe they've only got like a minute or something. So there's a few different things you can do to amp up the tension a little bit there and just make it a little bit more compelling as a story. And
but this is my whole point when I say I don't like dialogue heavy stories, right? Because that's frequently the issue that I have. Now, a comment that I will make, and I'll just be very open right now, a comment that I often make in my judging notes is this was just a conversation.
Yeah.
I didn't feel that way about this story, I want to be clear, because there is other stuff going on. But there are a lot of stories that I go, this is just a conversation, which means exactly what you just said. Nothing else happens or changes in the story. We've got two people talking. Yes, there might be a little bit of conflict, but it doesn't have that arc for a start, that rising and falling tension. It's all pretty much like if we picture it as a line, the line is a straight line. It's not rising and falling. We're not visually anywhere. We're in a blank. We could essentially be anywhere. It's a pretty blank room. And we're not getting those other elements of story like setting, character development sometimes is lacking. But certainly, like you say, the stakes, the conflict, that rising and falling tension, that building towards a change or some kind of big moment isn't there. We just sort of have back and forth, coming to like a resolution, but not necessarily coming to a climax, if that makes sense. And again, that's not a comment I made about this story, but just full disclosure, that is something that I think when I get a dialogue-heavy story. Now, in this one, like you say, there isn't a lot of action going on, and that is that balance issue where it's not about just insert an action beat. That's not the point, I don't think. I think the point is keeping the story moving towards something.
Yeah.
And dialogue can do that, but I don't think it necessarily does in this case because Charlotte just agrees.
Yeah.
We don't, again, it's that straight line, right? We don't have that tension building where we think, oh God, you know, he's put his foot in it. They're just back and forth. And then she's like, okay, yes, we'll go out. And then we have that like I said, we build to a resolution there where she makes the joke about, or he makes the joke, I beg your pardon, about verbal diarrhea being contagious, which is lovely because it calls back to the title.
Yep.
But it's not like a climactic moment emotionally for the reader because it just happened and everything was fine and she was happy with it and it was okay.
So one way I've been thinking about this, because the question here is like, how do you make your story more interesting and how do you make it more compelling? And, you know, it's not just more things happening all the time. But the way I think about this in terms of flash fiction, and it's not always like this, you know, disclaimer, this is not always the kind of story that you're writing, but think of it, the story that you're writing, as like an anecdote that you're telling someone, right? So imagine that you are Dylan and someone asks you how to go with Charlotte today.
Your children ask you, how did you meet our mother?
Or, you know, or it doesn't even have to be that loaded, but just, you know, how to go with Charlotte today. And Dylan in this story would answer, well, I was a bit nervous, but in the end I got it out and she said yes and we're going on a date. And that's the anecdote. That's the story that you're telling here. But imagine if it was like how to go with Charlotte and
you're like, get this.
And you're like, exactly, get this. Well, I was nervous, but I had a plan because, you know, my brother helped me come up with this. But then she turned up with this guy named Chad. And, you know, that threw me off.
Absolutely freaked out.
And I freaked out and I dropped the puzzle box into the pizza oven and, you know, but then it turned out the dude was her brother and really he brought her along to like try to ask me out as her wingman, and it all turned out like that's a whole different story, right? But it's a story that you're on the edge of your seat.
That's like very specific that you're coming up with this. I'm starting to question now, like where this is all coming from.
Yeah, but or whatever the details
are. Or whatever, exactly. I think it's very important to say or whatever because that's a specific story and it is a different story. But the point you make, I think, is very valid, which is like, how do we create that arc and physically that story arc, and you imagine the tension of your story building and rising to a climax and then that satisfying ending. And that's how you do it, right? You have not just stuff that happens. And so Sarah's question about like the balance of dialogue and action, it's not really about, okay, you need to have more stuff happening, because you can develop this stuff through dialogue only. That stuff can be revealed through dialogue, but there needs to be stuff. There needs to be rising tension as a result of the events of the story that are happening.
And I don't want to set the expectation that like every story has to have wacky, crazy shit happening, but that's because that's not the case. But it does need a little bit of something like that. And I'll stand by, like, it needs some wacky shit to happen. And I'm thinking back to our last round. One of our shortlisters was Greg Schmidt, who had a meet cute that started off with a fart.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a little bit wacky, but it's enough that it kind of drives the story.
Well, you've got to be careful there with that advice, because I think Sarah does, you know, she's got the verbal diarrhea thing. We're sort of down in that toilet humour kind of end of things. But I've actually felt this story was more similar to The Taste of Pie.
Yeah.
Because of the character, right? So we had in The Taste of Pie what I imagine to be a character who is neurodivergent. I feel like that's potentially an issue here. It maybe not, but like it's a little bit implied that he's not fully conscious of how he appears in social situations, maybe a bit awkward. It's not necessarily neurodivergence, but still that awkward social behaviour and that lack of self-awareness about that, I guess. But what Alexandria Bellani had in that story, which I think we've sort of already stated was maybe a little bit lacking in this story, was that rising tension. So we had two characters who hit it off right away. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, they really did. And the female character in that story was very into it very early. But then he puts his foot in it, right? And he leaves. Yeah. And you're like, right, it's all over, Red Rover. And then she comes back and she's like, how dare you? Yeah. No one's ever done this to me. And it is as a result of his specific, what you might think of as a character flaw, but his individuality, which actually wins the day. Like he starts drawing on you know, doing the sums on the board about like why they would never work. And then she kisses him. Yeah. And I think that's what we could have here too in a similar way. Like, what is it about Dylan specifically? And if we're saying verbal diarrhea is the thing that we're calling into focus here, as it was the numbers and that sort of sensory stuff that went on in the other story. What is it about his verbal diarrhea that actually wins the day in the end? Like, does he say something, or is it as a result of his over-talking that he wins her over after
After that conflict has happened.
After that conflict has happened. And I think there's an opportunity for that. So, and I think you need to work to that. So Sarah said she doesn't normally write romance, nor do I. But, you know, typically speaking, and same with Greg's story as well, we want that like tension, the will they, won't they. That's what's building. Will they, won't they? Will they, won't they? And you get to a point of, nah, it's a no.
Yeah.
And then after that, it's all saved. And I think the ones that are most satisfying are where it's saved by the unique trait. And so to bring two characters together because of who they are is what feels satisfying to me in a romance.
So I think we've done the big picture stuff, and I think we agree on that. And I will agree with what you said. I don't think Sarah should be concentrating on how do I balance dialogue versus non-dialogue. I think it's a bigger picture question of how do you craft that story and whether you choose to use more dialogue or less dialogue. And there's pros and cons. Obviously, a balance is good, but it does stem from that underlying story structure. I guess we've gone general. Let's just go back into the text a bit and close it out. So the last couple of lines, let's go for a drink, and who knows if it goes well, we might seal the deal with a kiss. Her face fell into her hands. Did I really just say that? And this is like, I guess it's coming back to what you were saying about making that connection over his verbal diarrhea.
Yeah.
And there is that aspect of it.
Yeah.
And then we end on the line, verbal diarrhea must be contagious, which is a really cheesy line. And I have to say that was difficult for me to read. But like, I don't mind a little bit of cheese, especially when it's
romance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think that's great. So I think what Sarah did really well there in that ending was some callbacks, right? We talk about circularity. So we've got the callback to the seal the deal joke, which is linked into the verbal diarrhea. And we've got, of course, the very explicit reference back to verbal diarrhea as well. So I think that's really great. You've paid those things off, which is what sort of builds to a satisfying conclusion. I think the satisfaction is probably a little bit dulled by the fact that we have already indicated there wasn't that tension in that climactic moment. It kind of just happened. But I think that could have been, you know, more satisfying if it had come off the back of that sort of tense moment. But yeah, both of those things are paid off, which is really fantastic. So I have questioned whether the puzzle box was paid off, and I don't think that it was, but I think these two aspects were. And I think that's really great. I think that's well done.
So, Sarah, you like to write with dialogue, and I think that is a strong point, especially early on in the story. Like the dialogue that establishes the characters does a really good job of establishing the characters. Again, it just comes down to how you develop that scene, how you develop that arc, and, you know, bring it home. And I don't think like you're too far off.
No.
Like you've got all of the elements of it there. I think the relationship between Dylan and Charlotte, like those characters, they make sense as characters. They make sense as characters who are attracted to each other. They make sense as like, you know, hooking up at the end and feeling good about that. I think it's just about like working through all of those elements that make that more satisfying.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good editing tip for most people. I think adding drama and adding conflict to a piece of flash fiction is almost always a good idea. I think most stories would benefit from like twisting the knife a little bit more on your characters. And so I think you write your first draft and then I think you can look at it and go, all right, but what else can I do? Like you said, Ed, about if it's an anecdote, well, what would make this more interesting? You know those people who come to a party and they've always got a great story?
Yeah.
They're full of shit half the time. Like they're embellishing stuff, they're adding stuff
that's what makes it interesting.
That's what makes it interesting. So I think embellishing, like within reason and certainly still feeling real, can add value. And I think you could embellish this story and get a little bit more out of it. But look, the story itself is lovely. And like I really got like that lightness from it. Like it felt fun. It felt like Sarah had fun writing it. I definitely got a sense of Dylan as a character, relatable. I experienced verbal diarrhea.
And Charlotte as a character. Like you embody both of these characters, don't you?
It's just me falling in love with myself.
Just your many personalities.
But Sarah said as well, like that she doesn't do beautiful prose, and like fuck off with that. Like that's come on. You said that in a moment of self-doubt because of course you can write beautiful prose and you know, it's great as writers to understand our strengths and weaknesses, and if you feel that dialogue is a strength for you, and I certainly got like some really bouncy, lovely dialogue here, so I would agree with that. But that doesn't mean you can't do the other stuff, and certainly doesn't mean you should avoid doing it. If you do feel like that's something you would like to work on, like work on it. Like bring it up to like the standard that you're holding yourself to, because I really feel like you have the capacity for that. I don't think you need to shy away from that.
And I think good prose is not just flowery prose or poetic sounding prose. I think prose, just as dialogue, is all about voice. So if you can do voice through dialogue, you can do voice through prose.
Yeah, and we all have those writers who we look up to who just seem to be able to write so beautifully and who just have such a way with words. And I imagine that's what Sarah's thinking of, these authors who just like, it just flows naturally and it never feels purple. It just feels beautiful. And I don't write that way either. But I don't think that's always necessary. I think there are stories that are beautiful for that reason. And then there are stories that are beautiful in their simplicity. Like sometimes you just need to tell me what happened and that's enough. I don't need it to be expressed in a flowery way for that to really grip me. I think ultimately focusing on character, focusing on story, like what makes a satisfying story is key. And the language and how you express that, that's you. That's your authorial voice. And it's beautiful even if it's simple. It should come from you. And if it's not natural to you to write in this flowery way, then don't do it. But that doesn't mean like it's not going to be received as beautiful prose.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I agree. So don't let that hold you back. All right. So before we wrap up, let's just take a look at the prompts. So we have the word prompt seal, and you've used 7 instances in different meanings and like very linked to, I guess, your character here, which is a great use of it. The action prompt wiping, in this case, was wiping out his chance at hooking up with Charlotte, which I think we've said this a little bit during this round, like using the actual words wiping out stood out a lot to us. I think like in this story, there was an opportunity maybe to actually have him wipe out in his attempt to ask her out, fall over, do something that
fall into the oil,
and could go dark. But like one way or another, have him fail and then redeem himself, which is the plot of every single romance.
Yeah.
So you didn't need to use that literally.
Yeah, and I think like that's why we have the brief explanation field too. Like it allows you, like if you're worried that we didn't pick up on your interpretation of the action prompt, then you get a chance to explain that. Yeah. And I think I would prefer that than the sort of more explicit use of the language. But like whatever, like it wasn't a big thing. It's only because we're judging all these stories and we're seeing it all the time.
It's highly visible.
Yeah.
And so the anti-prompt here is the fact that Dylan is told by his brother to kill his darling, and his darling in this situation was his verbal diarrhea. And that turns out to be, one of the things that makes him charming. And I think that's a great premise and it's a great response to the prompt. But
Sarah also mentioned that she kept that final cheesy line as well, and that was her darling that she kept in. And I think that's nice too. I think I'm a sucker for that. Like I write to please myself first and foremost, and I did get the sense that Sarah had fun writing this story. I said already, like, I think cheese works in a romance. It works for me anyway. Like, I love a bit of cheesy romance. So I think that worked in this story, and you did make it work in your favour, and that was the challenge. So well done.
Absolutely.
So I don't think we've gone any easier on Sarah this round than we did previously. I think we had some insights here that I hope you'll use and use to grow. Like, overall, this was a fun story. The dialogue worked for me. I think it had all the elements there, and I think it was just a matter of like just maybe working on that plot structure.
Yeah, there were some great elements here. The dialogue was strong. The relationship was strong. But yeah, we did like this story, and it wasn't too far off the long list. It was definitely in the pile of maybes.
So thanks for sharing another fun story with us. And like so different too. Like you're obviously a versatile author.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Sarah. And we'll be back again next week with our third Daredevil.
Can't wait.
Until then, ride on.
Ride on.
We hope you enjoyed this special Daredevil episode of Not Quite Right. If you have thoughts on this story, follow us on social media and join the conversation. And if you'd like to participate in the next round of the competition, head over to our website at notquiteright.com. That's WRITE.
Something doesn't seem quite right.
Dylan paced the stockroom. He clutched the puzzle box as he rehearsed the lines prepared by his brother. Black sweat soaked through his uniform. Black sweat.
Ew.
Back sweat soaked through his uniform, but there was no time to change. Charlotte walked through the door.
Morning. How am I going to say it? Hang on.
Have you seen the meme where the women are like, "You're right." Yeah. How are you? Good. You good. You good.
There's this bit in adolescence, actually, where they're like walking through the office and like, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. And me and Andy always make fun of you're right. I think I've told you about it before, but you absolutely had to be there. There was this like news story about a koala that had like stowed away on a plane and arrived in the UK or something like that. It was so fucking weird. And then we just had our own personal joke, and I don't really remember the full context, but that was the basic context, where the koala arrives in the UK and they're like surprised that the koala's there, and then they just go, you're right. Like, that's just how they respond.
Want a cup of tea?
Yeah. So now whenever I hear, you're right, I just picture this koala and like people in the UK to see like,
Koala's like,
right.
I'm not in the right place.
So then in adolescence when they're walking around the police stations, they're like, you're right. Like, I was losing it. Anyway, start again.
Okay.
Just start again.
Dylan paced the stockroom. He clutched the puzzle box as he rehearsed the lines prepared by his brother. Black sweat soaked through his uniform. I said it again. Fucking.
Once you go black, you can never go back.